Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Louisa Lombard, an assistant professor of anthropology at Yale University. She is a cultural anthropologist who studies African borderland areas where the state is largely absent and a range of actors govern. Her research locales, primarily the remote and little-populated eastern reaches of the Central African Republic, are further marked by violent histories that continue into the present. Professor Lombard's main fieldwork interlocutors are among the region's men-in-arms, such as anti-poaching guards and rebels. Today we talk with Professor Lombard about her recently published paper on violence, popular punishment, and the war in the Central African Republic. Welcome, Professor Lombard.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
So let's begin with an overview of your paper. Tell us about it.
So there's been a war ongoing in the Central African Republic for the past couple of years, and a lot of people, both in the Central African Republic and beyond, have been surprised by how quickly the violence spread and came to involve so much of the population. Now, a range of different explanations have been brought forth as to how this happened. Politicians, for instance, the president of the country, has argued that this is a case of manipulation, that politico-military entrepreneurs are manipulating people into fighting, into perpetuating the war. And in this paper, we argue that although those factors are indeed quite important, they miss something really important as well, and that is the important place of violent popular punishment in the country even prior to the war. And we argue that, war is not a complete break from the past. It doesn't reflect a total new situation. It reflects rather the continuation, the transformation of existing social practices. Okay. So we try to explain a little bit about how this context of popular punishment developed in the Central African Republic, both through the colonial period into the independent era, and as the country has really seen its economic situation be plummet and be eviscerated, and a widespread feeling of insecurity has come to dominate people's lives. And in that context of insecurity and of even a kind of pervasive anomie, by which I mean a situation in which people feel like existing norms no longer really help them understand their lives, and no longer really serve to control the kinds of threats that they feel like they face. In that kind of context, popular punishment became quite widespread and often entailed quite a bit of violence as well.
Okay. What do you mean by popular punishment?
That's an excellent question. So when and I should say that this is an article that I co-authored with a Central African colleague, Sylvain Batianga-Kinzi. So when we're using this term popular punishment, we're referring to things that other scholars have referred to as popular justice, kind of vigilantism. People, for instance, when there's a suspected thief who is apprehended and that thief is beaten by a crowd to try to show him that this is not something that he should be doing. And the reason that we use the term popular punishment is because we think that it's more analytically precise. The term justice, if we're referring to popular justice, it implies that this is something that people feel is the ideal way that a problem should be resolved. And what we see instead is people are very ambivalent about this popular punishment. They see it as necessary given the grave threats that they face, but they see it as very, very far from ideal. And we wanted to capture that people are talking about the need to punish the people who are bringing the threats into their lives, but that is not exactly the same thing as justice.
Right. So rather than the police handling the problem, people are dealing with the situation themselves?
Yes, and sometimes people will hire individual members of the police or the gendarmerie to come and help them in this regard, but they're doing that, the police officers are then acting in their kind of private capacity and often will participate in the violence themselves.
And why would that happen versus the police having a role in arresting the thief and bringing them to jail?
Well, the police, are perennially under-resourced. Okay. They don't really have the capacity to deal with these kinds of situations themselves, and for that matter, they're often participating in these kinds of violent punishments themselves. They see it as necessary also. I mean, during one of our interviews was with a gendarme who, in the middle of the night, noticed that somebody was trying to break into his house. So he went and found the person and began beating the person. The commotion drew other people from his neighborhood who came in and started beating the person as well. They ended up beating the man to within just an inch of his life. And at that point, the gendarme thought, well, maybe this wasn't the right way to deal with this. And they managed to stop the beating and bring the man to the hospital, but he died shortly thereafter. And that gendarme said, look, the gendarmerie is corrupt. Everybody is corrupt. And so we have to take matters into our own hands.
Right. You would think, though, that with that level of punishment, no crimes would be committed.
One would hope, but that's always I mean, we see this elsewhere as well, that the deterrent factor that is hoped for in punishment for crimes does not always work in the ways that we would like.
I mean, of course, capital punishment is a perfect example of that. What led you to do this kind of work? How did you find yourself in Central Africa?
Well, that's a long story at this point, but while I was an undergraduate, it was close to when I was graduating, and I went to a talk by somebody about his research in the Central African Republic, and I thought, here I am, and I've been studying Africa for all this time, and here's a country that I've barely even heard of. How is this possible? I want to know more. And so I got to know that man and ended up working for him. He became the managing director of a research institute called the Small Arms Survey, and I went to the country a number of times working for them, doing research on the social impacts of having guns, pretty widespread in the society.
Now, that was before the war broke out, or just about during?
Yes. So I should clarify a little bit there. There's been a lot of conflict in the Central African Republic over the last 20 years or so. It's intermittent. It'll happen in different parts of the country at different times. It's only in the last couple of years that we've seen a real qualitative shift, and it's become a situation that I would describe as war.
And who is the war between? I mean, is it more political based, more religious based, a combination?
So that's an excellent question. If you read newspaper articles about what's going on in the Central African Republic, they'll often say that there are two main groups, that there is the Seleka Rebel Alliance and that there's the anti-Balaka rebel group. The problem with that way of thinking about what's going on in the country is that having these two names for the different the opposing sides masks the fact that what we have here is not two groups with a kind of organized hierarchy and structures of command and objectives and all of that. Instead, we have two very diffuse processes of violent mobilization that are in many cases happening on a kind of village basis. And so it's a much more diffuse and widespread process of mobilization than a lot of the more journalistic accounts might lead you to believe. Now, this is one of the reasons why it's been so hard to draw the fighting to an end. It's because there aren't two people, one person on each side who you can have sit down together and talk through a peace process, and then they tell their subordinates and their subordinates tell their subordinates, now it's time to stop. Instead, again, this is a much more non-centralized kind of war in which people are fighting over things that in many cases are reflect sort of long-standing localized tensions more than they do any kind of grand political objective.
And how large of an area are we talking about, and how many people are involved?
Well, that's a difficult question, for one thing, just because it's very difficult to obtain information about what's going on in areas outside of the capital. At this point, things have been calming down. The UN just deployed a peacekeeping force to the Central African Republic just 2 days ago. So the violence is at a lower point at this point, but it has involved I would say, you know, the southwestern part of the country, the northwestern part of the country, the northeastern part of the country. Really, the only area that has been largely spared is the southeastern corner of the country, which is just very hard to get to and has its own dynamics of conflict. It's one of the areas where the Lord's Resistance Army is believed to be hanging out. So.
Wow, okay. You know, I'm curious about, you know, how the methodology to write the article. You know, how did you do it? I mean, it seems like it would be somewhat difficult to get all of the information you need based on what you've said. So how did you go about writing it?
Well, how did we go about writing it, or how did we go about doing the research?
The research.
So I'm an anthropologist, so I do ethnographic field research, and that involves a lot of, you know, deep hanging out, getting to know people, spending time with them, observing, participating in their lives, and then also doing interviews and trying to find out what the sources of social tension are. And this article is really the product of a very long engagement with the Central African Republic.
How long?
So I've been going there since 2003, so over 10 years at this point.
Wow.
And I wanted to, you know, I felt like a lot of the people who were trying to explain what was going on in the war over the last 2 years were acting as if prior to the outbreak of war in 2012, there had been a kind of peaceful baseline. And so I wanted to draw attention to the fact that I had observed a lot of violence over my decade of getting to know people in the country, and that this is something that I think is troubling and needs to be addressed.
In spending so much time there, were you ever fearful for your own life as a woman and as a white woman?
You know, that's a question that I get asked a lot. The short answer is no, I was not. The longer answer is that through the years I've built up a network of people I trust, and I ask them. I ask them what it's safe for me to do, what I should avoid doing, what's going to arouse suspicions, and I listen to them and I follow their advice. And so if somebody who, you know, whose hospitality I would be relying on says, no, don't come here right now, you know, don't come to this town, then I listen to them and I don't go there, and I'll go somewhere else, because I'm really interested in trying to better understand dynamics of conflict, how they work, how it happens, all of these kinds of things. But I'm not interested in getting myself into situations that I can't get myself out of. And I think that my method, you know, the ethnographic method in some senses is helpful in this regard, because I know that in order to do effective research, I have to be able to rely on trust from my interlocutors. And if I'm going into a situation where tensions are just too high, then I'm not going to be able to do that anyway. So better to, you know, better to save my energies for places where I can do my research more effectively.
Okay, well, let's talk about some of your findings in your paper. Tell us about, you know, some of the conclusions that you come to.
So in the conclusion of the paper, we argue that, again, this is coming out of my experience both doing research in the country and then also providing briefings and other kinds of things for different members of international agencies that are trying to stop the violence and build peace in the country. You know, and those types of organizations, they tend to focus on institutions. They tend to focus on the formal state structures, which in the Central African Republic are extremely weak. So that's an important goal in certain respects. But at the same time, I think that in order to prevent real outbreaks of violence in the country in the future, we need to pay greater attention also to the place of violence and even vengeance and popular punishment in Central Africans' sort of conceptions of how to deal with threats that they face in their midst. Because this situation of very pervasive insecurity, that is probably not going to end anytime soon. So there needs to be some kind of reckoning as to, you know, reckoning for Central Africans, among Central Africans, as to the place of popular punishment and vengeance in dealing with those kinds of problems.
So I mean, how would you go about changing that? It seems like it's part of the culture at this point, having gone on for so many years, popular punishment. How do you turn that around? I mean, how do you fix something like that?
Well, the interesting thing about culture is that you can have long-established patterns, and there is always the possibility of change, and change is continual as well. And I think that you know, if there were some kind of a really widespread, localized sort of forum for talking about the sources of insecurity and trying to deal with the sources of insecurity that Central Africans feel in some kind of effective way, then that might be a way to diminish the importance of popular punishment. You know, doing that in concert with trying to support the state security sector in ways that will help them to be more accountable to people and more effective in dealing with the threats that people feel like they are facing, which primarily have to do with theft and witchcraft.
Really?
Yeah.
I was going to say, is food an issue, or lack of jobs, that kind of thing? But
that's absolutely an issue as well.
Okay.
But it all happens in a context in which the forces of the occult, the kind of invisible world, are seen as playing a really important role in people's lives, and a really dangerous role in people's lives.
That is fascinating. I had no idea that was an element. So tell us a little bit more about that. Historically, has that been the case there?
Yes, it has historically been the case there. I mean, it's always, talking about witchcraft in Africa is a really fraught thing to do, because when we hear the word witchcraft, we think, women wearing black pointy hats and Halloween and all of that kind of stuff.
The
and
Western version.
We assume that that's what we're dealing with in Africa as well. And instead, it's more... It more has to do with the fact that people understand there to be a visible world that we can see and observe, and then also an invisible world where there are forces that we can't control, and that those invisible world forces are also having a really important impact on the ways that are the sort of vicissitudes of our lives.
And are there some people who are said to have some control over that other world?
Yes, there are people who are referred to the Nganga, the traditional healers, who have a lot of knowledge of the invisible world and some power to manage it. But one of the reasons why people feel like there's such pervasive insecurity now is that the forms of witchcraft, these kind of occult forces that are part of people's lives, have really transformed and become ever more powerful, surpassing these Nganga's capacity to deal with it.
Wow. Very interesting. Well, I could talk to you all day about that. But final question, what do you think the future holds for Central Africa?
That's a really difficult question.
Yes.
The Central African Republic has been dealt a really difficult hand by history, and unfortunately that's not going to change anytime soon. I do think that the kind of war-type violence that we've seen over the past couple of years, that is abating. And there have been, there are a number of different initiatives that are being spearheaded by international actors to try to build peace in the country. I have some skepticisms about the approach of a lot of them, but at this point the country has come to quite a nadir, and I hope that means that the only way to go is up, even if that is a very slow and fitful process.
Right. Well, hopefully that will be the case. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for chatting with me.
Sure. For more information about Professor Lombard and her work, please visit our website at yale.edu/MacMillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.